In this video, we talk about defining your own functions. Before you write your own functions, it is helpful to understand that when a function is called by the main program, control is passed from the calling program to the function code executes, and when that process is complete, control is returned to the calling program. We can think of this as program execution, taking a bit of a journey from the calling program to the called function and back again. While the function that was called is executing, the program that called it does nothing. Its execution is paused until the function completes, and then when the function returns control, the calling program can continue executing at the point just beyond the function call. Control is always passed, but there is also the issue of whether or not information is passed between the calling program and the function. When we consider this aspect of function usage, there are 4 possibilities for the connection between a function and the program that calls it. In this video, we work through all 4 of those. This should give you an understanding of the different ways in which you can write functions to do some of the work required in programs that you develop. We'll start with the simplest situation, a function that has no parameters, so it receives no information when it is called, and it returns no information. A function like this would be useful if you wanted to create a nice user interface for your program, perhaps by displaying a menu of options for the user. For example, let's consider a function that displays a menu for an inventory maintenance system. We can call that function with a very simple statement shown here in the main program. Just like when you call a built-in function, execution of the call to the menu function causes control to pass to that function. The function will execute one line at a time. And when the return statement is reached, control goes back to main. Main starts up after the call to menu, which in the example is the print statement that prints OK. We can see this process in Python Tutor. This is the same code that was on the slide, and we'll visualize the execution. The first thing that happens is Python indicates that it knows that the menu function exists, and it knows that the main function exists. And then it calls main. Main in turn calls menu. And now each statement of menu will execute. We can see here on the right that the menu is going to be printed out one line at a time. And that keeps going until execution hits the return statement. Return basically says, send control back to whoever called the function. In this case, control will go back to main. You can see that menu is getting ready to return, and it says that there's no return value, that the return value is none. And so when we execute the return, we can see that control is now back in main at the statement immediately after the call to menu, which is the print statement, and that print statement will execute, giving OK in the output. The next kind of function is one that receives some information, but does not return any information when it finishes executing. This setup is common if we write functions that are used to generate nicely formatted output. For example, if we stick with our inventory example, we might have a function like this prettyPrint function. When prettyPrint is called, 3 pieces of information present in the function call are passed to the three parameters in the function definition, giving those parameters values that are used during function execution. We can see this unfold in Python Tutor. So we see that pretty print is defined, main is defined, and then main is called, and main calls pretty print. And we can see that the assignment of values to parameters was done at the time of call. So the string no name laptop was assigned to the parameter item in pretty print. 25 was assigned to quantity, and 750 was assigned as the value of price. And control has been given to pretty print. So now pretty print will execute one line at a time. The first line of output says that in inventory we have 25 of no name laptop because 25 was the value passed to quantity and no name laptop was the value passed to item. In the second line, price will have the value 750 and the total will be computed from this multiplication between quantity and price. So information came into pretty print when it was called. It does its output operation. No information will be returned. And so again, we see that the return value will be none and control goes back to main. And because there is no other statement, that's the end of the program. Next, we'll define a function that has no parameters. So it receives no information, but it does return information. You would use a function like this to perhaps display a menu, as we did earlier, and also get the user's choice and return it to the calling program. Calling this function is a bit different than when we called our original menu function, because now we have to have a variable that can receive the value returned by the function. The way to think of this is that the call to user option on the right-hand side of this assignment will be replaced by the value that is returned from the function. And then that value will be assigned to the variable on the left, in this case, the variable action. And then I will verify that that worked by printing out the value of action afterward. User option is defined, and we see it expects no values because it has no parameters. Main is defined, and then main is called. So here we are at line 14, the assignment statement. The assignment cannot take place until there is a value on the right-hand side. And there will be no value on the right-hand side until the function user option executes. So the call is made to user option. The menu is printed out. And here we are at line 9, which is a place where the user is asked for input. And we'll enter our choice. If you were running in regular Python, not in Python Tutor, you would just type your choice and hit enter. Here, I'll type my choice and click submit. And now we can see that we're at line 10, which is the return statement, which will return control, but we're also returning the value of choice. That is, we are returning the value associated with the variable choice in user option, which is that character A that I entered as my option. This means that the return value, instead of being none, as it was earlier, is now the string A. Control will go back to main And we can see now that the assignment has taken place. An action, the variable action, has the value A. Next, the blank line will print, and then the message confirming the user's choice, the user's desired action. Finally, our last category of function is those that both receive information and return information. So they have parameters and return values. These are functions that we generally use to do calculations. The vast majority of functions you write will be this kind of function. Information is passed to the function. The function carries out some calculation that is relevant to the problem being solved, and then it returns the result. We can see this with a variation on our earlier pretty print function. This time I'll leave the printing in main, but compute the value of the item in a separate function. We'll head to Python Tutor once again to visualize execution. The value function is defined. Main is defined. We call main. Main will assign 25 to quantity, no name laptop to item, 750 to price, and then it calls a print statement, passes it some information. So the print statement can generate a statement about the quantity of no name laptop we have. And then the program is ready for the next print statement. But this second print statement cannot actually execute until it has all of its component parts. It won't have the last piece of information until it calls the value function and value returns a result. So it calls value, passing it quantity and price. And we can see that the value function now has its own memory space and its own variables for quantity and price. Generally, you do want to use the same names in a function as you used in the calling program because it makes your code more readable and understandable, because the quantity variable and value is fundamentally referring to the same thing as the quantity variable in main. Our value function is so simple that it simply does the computation needed in the return statement and returns the resulting value. So we can see that the return value will be 18,750. And when that value is sent back, it will be plugged right into this spot in the print statement, and the print statement can execute. Finally, we'll look at an example where we have two user-defined functions and one calls the other. Basically, we have both our earlier pretty print function and our value function. Originally, pretty print did a computation directly in the second print statement. But in this version, I have modified pretty print so that it calls value to do the computation. So the main program sets up the call to pretty print, passing it three pieces of information, one for the item, one for the quantity, one for the price. So I can see that pretty print now has its three pieces of information. And because it has those three pieces of information, it has the information it needs in order to call value function. So the first print happens, and then the second print statement in pretty print will call the value function. It is passed, value is passed the quantity and price information. And we can see once again, it can return the 18,750, which will come back to pretty print and get printed out in the second print statement. That wraps up our tour of the 4 different kinds of function setups you can have when you write your own code, when you write your own functions. So when writing your own functions, you always should consider the following. What part of the program's job can you compartmentalize into a function? You want to think in particular about operations that need to be done more than one time. So writing that code once, but using it from different parts of the program is helpful for the development of your program. You want to think about whether the function needs to receive any data in order to do its job. And if so, exactly what data does it need? And you should think about whether the calling program needs to receive results from the function, which is connected to the job that the function is doing. So you need to be clear on how the results will be used by the calling program. You should answer these questions and think about the flow of control and the flow of data before you actually write any functions. Thinking about these questions, answering these questions while you're developing the design of a program will save you a lot of trouble later on as you're writing code and trying to get your programs to work.